What's going on, guys? Today I'm going to show you how to use the useEffect hook. If you're familiar with the lifecycle methods of class-based components, the useEffect hook is basically all of those methods rolled up into one convenient function. If you're not familiar with those lifecycle methods, you're very lucky. useEffect is a function that you can configure to run every time a component mounts or unmounts, or every re-render, or only on the first render. It's very powerful and not as hard as it sounds. So with this application, I have this parent component. This whole page is a posts page component, and then a nested child component of post component. And I can send in this increment count into the child component, making this re-render. And this is where we're going to use the useEffect. And I can also type in this input, causing multiple re-renders as well. And then in the code, this is that posts page parent component where I have the count and the user, and I send them into the child component of posts with the count and the user. And then in the posts component, I have the count displayed. I have the input that I was typing in to cause re-renders, and then I'll fetch posts from an API, which I'll display here. This I'm checking for posts. If it's true, I'll display those posts, and if it's false, I'll display nothing. So to use useEffect, we'll import it just as we do with useState. It's a named import. And useEffect is a function, and it takes two parameters. The first one is a function, and this is the function that will get called every time useEffect is called. And that'll always get called on the initial render. And in this function, you can do whatever you want. You can retrieve data from the back end. You can authenticate a user and set the user for that component or that page. And the second argument is a dependency array, and we'll get to that in a minute. So I just want to start off with console.logging useEffect so we can see when that runs. And in the component, I want to console.log render. So if I save that, we get, when I saved it, it re-rendered it. So we get a render and then the useEffect. And if I send in props into this post component, it's going to render again. And because we didn't put in the dependency array, it's just going to call useEffect on every single re-render. So that's going to do a bunch of useEffects. This input here, every time it's going to re-render and call multiple useEffects. You usually don't want to call it that often, especially if you're reaching out to a back end and retrieving data or doing something else expensive memory-wise. And that's where the dependency array comes in. The dependency array is a list of properties that the useEffect depends on. So if a property is in the useEffect or in the component even, if it's in this array, it'll be tracking that, and if it changes, it'll call useEffect. So let me show you. If I do props.count, which is coming from that increment count button here, I'll refresh this. This is our initial render and useEffect. If I type in the input now, we're going to get a bunch of renders, but no useEffect because of that dependency array. And now if I send in that count property, that will call useEffect. But if you want to call useEffect on the initial render and then not worry about it and not have it call on any re-renders, you just send in an empty dependency array. This is basically telling the useEffect that it has no properties that it depends on. And so after that initial useEffect, when the component renders, no matter what properties change and cause re-renders, this useEffect will never get called again. So I'll save that. I'm going to refresh this. So we get our initial render and initial useEffect. but now nothing will call that useEffect again. Now let's fetch some data. I'll use fetch, and I have a JSON placeholder API that I'm going to use for some dummy data. We'll do a .then response.json, and then we'll call it data. These will be the posts that we get back. We'll say set posts data. And since we have the dependency array empty, it's just going to call that first initial useEffect, and then it won't call it again, which is what we want, because we just want to retrieve the data when we go to that page or when we pull up that component. So these are our posts in a completely different language. And I'll refresh this so we get that initial render, that initial useEffect, and then another render because we retrieved data and we set the state, so that changed a property, which caused another render. And something I want to warn you about is if we don't have this in here, we're going to have an infinite loop. I'm not panicking, you're panicking. So the reason that happened is when we call set posts here, we're changing a property, causing a re-render. So the useEffect fires on that initial render every time, and then set posts, when we get our data back, is changing property, causing a re-render, causing the useEffect to run, which causes a re-render, because we don't have this dependency array. So again, we'll just add that empty dependency array, causing it to only run on that initial render, and then not again. So if I go back to posts, we get render, useEffect, render, and we don't get that infinite loop. But let's say we wanted to call useEffect not just on the initial render and not on every re-render, but when the user changes, because we want to get different posts for that user. The way this API works is we have users and then a number which represents the user, and then posts, which are the posts of that user. And this parent component, I have that change user button, which is changing the user by incrementing this number and sending it into the post component. And so I can use that here with props.user, and then a dependency array, we'll say props.user. So if I save that, I'll refresh this. We get that initial render and useEffect. We get the data, and now nothing else is causing useEffect to run again until I say change user, and then we get different posts, and the useEffect was called again because of that dependency array. We have the user in that array. And then the last thing I want to show you is that we can return something from useEffect. And what that is a function also, and that's a cleanup function. So this function is going to run every time the component unmounts. And so if you have an event listener that you start here, you can remove the event listener in the cleanup function when the component unmounts. If you were to subscribe to an observable, you can unsubscribe in the cleanup function. So I'll do a set timeout. And we'll have that called after 4 seconds. And we'll do a console.log data fetched for when that set timeout is finished. So when I save this, the initial render and useEffect will be triggered, and then 4 seconds later, we'll get this data fetched. So I'll save it now. I'll go over here, data fetched. Now the problem is when we do change user and it triggers it again, if we leave the page, it still was happening in the background. We don't want that. And that's where this cleanup function comes into play. So let's see, I'll put this in a const called timeout. And then in this cleanup function, I'll do clear timeout and pass in that timeout. And now, I'm going to refresh this. Now when I go to post, it's going to call that useEffect, but when I leave, it won't finish. So there's the useEffect, but when I leave the page, it never happens because of that cleanup function and because we're awesome developers. So that's useEffect. There's kind of a lot to it, but once you understand it and you use it a little bit, it's not too bad. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Check it.